Let's call in someone who knows quite a bit about that. Boston criminal defense attorney Geoffrey Nathan. Jeff, it's so good to have you Skyping in from Boston. You were with us a week ago saying, look, plea deal, some sort of agreement is going to take place. Whether or not that happens, it's gone to jury selection. Let's concentrate on that. When you're trying to put together a jury, especially in a case as infamous, as notorious as the Marathon Bomber, how tough is that going to be?
Extremely difficult to select a jury in a case of this magnitude, because you've got to spend the pretrial time drafting what is called voir dire questions that the judge can ask the jurors whether or not they can be fair and impartial, and if so, how. And then you've got to delve into the jurors' backgrounds, and you've got to ask the judge for permission to be able to speak to the jury directly. You want to ask them the questions yourselves, so you get into a fight with the judge as to who gets to ask these questions. And then when it comes down to the final crunch of how is the jury going to vote, you've got to work on more questions. So it's one of the more difficult tasks at law, frankly.
Geoffrey, if you were defending Tsarnaev, what would be some of the questions that you would be asking these potential jurors?
Well, you'd want to know whether or not they've got connections to law enforcement. And then secondly, you want to know whether or not they've already made up their mind based upon their viewing of the media reports in this case. And then you want to exclude those jurors because if they've already made up their mind, there's really not that much that you're going to be able to do as a defense lawyer, frankly, to be able to persuade them that he was not guilty of a particular offense. Although you've then got to worry about the statements that he made to law enforcement. So there's a whole heck of a lot you've got to do in a case like this. It's a staggering amount of work.
What about the death penalty? Because obviously the defense attorney is trying to get life in prison, not the death penalty. What are the chances of that happening? Or how likely is that to happen, I should say?
It's pretty good that he would not get the death penalty for two reasons. One, that's a decision that the jury has to make, and that it has to be a unanimous decision. And if it's not a unanimous decision, the judge has to take over sentencing and has to impose the sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. So I don't see it being a unanimous decision, frankly. In those cases where the death penalty has been sought in the United States District Court in Boston have been a whole failure, because the system breaks down and they wind up getting death penalty trial after death penalty trial after death penalty trial, because the appeals court steps in and they take the case away from the jury and they say, oh no, you have to do it again. And so realistically, that's why I've said, look, let's just break this down to a plea agreement, stick this kid in a supermax facility and be done with him. That's why I say that.
30 seconds remain, Geoffrey. Just very curious. In your mind, is there any way they're going to find an unbiased jury in Boston for this case with Tsarnaev?
Eventually, sure, because the issue is not necessarily unbiased, but whether or not they are biased. And so you can have an inclination as a juror to say, well, I think that, the evidence is probably there, but I'm willing to be fair and impartial as I sit as a juror. And that's the standard. And so for that reason, you're going to see a jury be seated, because the judge who's overseeing the jury selection process is going to make sure that that happens.
Fair enough. There is more ahead with Geoffrey Nathan on yet another case. Stay with us.
And rejoining us once again via Skype is criminal defense attorney Geoffrey Nathan. Thank you so much for staying with us. Geoffrey, today Hernandez will be in court for a second day of jury selection after being charged with the murder of semi-pro football player Odin Lloyd. By the end of Tuesday, more than 1,000 people will have been questioned, and about 18 of those people will be selected for the jury. To give our audience an idea, is that not the largest jury pool that you've seen when it comes to a state case?
Indeed it is, and the reason for that is twofold. One is because of Hernandez's overwhelming popularity, notoriety in Massachusetts. You've got to get an enormous pool, because you want to weed out people who are fans of his. And so Fee and his colleagues have a big task ahead of them to make sure that an impartial jury is selected in regards to this matter.
Now, as I understand it, each potential juror has to fill out a questionnaire, and on that questionnaire, if you were the defense attorney, what questions would you have on it?
You'd want to make sure that the jurors are able to formulate an opinion after all of the evidence has been received and not beforehand. And then there are issues in this case as to the possibility of juror sequestration. And so you've got to ask the jurors whether or not they're prepared for that. And if so, how would their families be impacted? So there's a whole host of things that go involved when you're dealing with a trial of a former NFL superstar like Hernandez.
How long do you expect the jury selection process to take?
2 to 3 days to 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, it's really hard to tell. You'd be awfully surprised. Sometimes you get a pool of jurors, a so-called veneer, and you rip right through it, and you're done faster than you can possibly imagine. And then there's other times in which you get jurors complaining like mad, but also what you got to watch out for in this particular matter is your so-called wannabe jurors. Those are jurors who are striving and fighting like mad to get on the jury, and those may not be people you really want to have as your jurors. So it's a tough case to sit a jury on. Wow.
Geoffrey, we've got about a minute and a half left. I want to switch the focus from jury selection to possible witnesses. Now, the Patriots are getting ready to host the AFC title game against the Colts, but there's talk that the coach, Bill Belichick, and the team owner, Bob Kraft, may be called upon to testify. Do you expect that to happen?
I think that there's going to be a rush to get them on as witnesses, but I think that their lawyers are going to fight those witness subpoenas like there's no tomorrow and move to quash the subpoenas to call them as a witness because, first of all, someone like Kraft, who's the owner of the Patriots, doesn't want to be sitting there as a witness in the Hernandez matter. And second of all, the coach has got better things to do than to talk about whether or not he ever saw Hernandez with a gun. And his lawyers are going to be rushing into court like there's no tomorrow to tell the judge as to why they don't have anything to say and why the subpoenas should be quashed. So I think you can expect that fight to happen down the line, frankly.
With about 10, 15 seconds now to go, real quickly, do you think a plea deal is possible at this point?
Absolutely not. It's way too late for that. That's already been offered, and that's off the table as far as I'm concerned. No way.
All right, Geoffrey, Nathan, as always, we appreciate your insights and analysis because you've been in the courtroom on both sides. Coming up next, not about becoming a male model, but becoming a model man. Larry Stockstill will be here to tell us about his new book. That's next on America's Forum.